So our first question is about the ways in which education facilitates either corporate conformity or some form of subservience to the elite. So at Penn, nearly half of graduating students pursue either consulting or finance, careers which don't benefit society at large, nor typically capture the talents, intelligence, and also the passions of a lot of young students and graduates, but rather reinforce the entrenched capitalist hierarchies of society. So a recent linked survey from Goldman Sachs a few weeks ago revealed that first-year analysts right out of college were working 100-hour work weeks and suffering from abuse and severe discontent with their jobs and personal lives. You said at one point that, quote, schools have always played an institutional role in a system of control and coercion. And once you're well educated, you are socialized in ways that support the power structure, which rewards you immensely. What are the ways in which we can challenge and dismantle the soul and passion-sapping ethos of our education system today? Oh, by the way, Professor Chomsky, you're muted. So just unmute yourself if you can. Just press the mute button at the bottom to unmute yourself. Should be next to stop video.
I got it.
How's that? You're working, great.
You can do it the way students have been doing it ever since I arrived at Penn in 1945, constantly. Always things like this going on. Sometimes they're quite successful. In fact, you're beginning to do it right now, or maybe continuing to. So take, actually at Penn, when I was there in the late 40s, there was nothing much going on. It was right after the war. Everything was just beginning again. But in many later years, lots of things have happened. Take the university where I spent most of my life, MIT. 1960s, MIT was one of the most conservative universities in the country. Scientists, engineers, nobody interested in anything, doing their work. A small group of students, maybe 7 or 8, formed a collective, the Rosa Luxemburg Collective, started organizing among students on all sorts of issues, a lot of them local issues, student issues, and going on to the big things that were happening in the world, the Vietnam War and others. Within a couple of years, the university had totally shifted, became the most radical university in the country. The head of this group was the most active student in this group, was elected student president on a platform so radical you couldn't believe it. I won't go through it, just everything you could imagine. The whole institute was shut down for 2 solid weeks when there was a draft resistor Marine deserter, actually, who was taking sanctuary in the student union. Students had set it up. Literally, practically the whole university was there 24 hours a day, seminars, rock concerts, every crazy thing that was going on. And the whole place just totally changed. And out of it came continuing institutions like, I don't know if you may know, the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a very important left activist science group, grew out of this, other things. That's how you do it. There's no secret. It's happened in many places. It's going to be crushed. Every effort will be made to crush it. It was what happened in the 60s was very upsetting to power groups. If you haven't done it, you might want to read 2 very important documents that came out in the early 70s responding to this. One of them is the Powell Memorandum, short memorandum written by corporate lawyer, became Supreme Court Justice under Nixon. It was written to the Chamber of Commerce, the main business group. And it's semi-hysterical. We're talking about how the business world is being attacked, it's being destroyed, we've lost the universities, but then he ended up saying, look, we have the money. they don't have it. We can fight back and smash them all. And that is a large part of was picked up, large part of it led to the neoliberal assault. Meanwhile, on the what's called the left, Trilateral Commission, basically the Carter administration liberals, they have a document called Crisis of Democracy. It's very much worth reading. He said that the 1960s has brought about a terrible crisis of democracy. All sorts of what they call special interests, groups that are supposed to just watch things and obey, have tried to enter the political arena to press their demands. Young people, old people, women, farmers, workers, in other words, the general population who don't belong there. And they were particularly worried about the universities. What they said is the universities have failed in their duty to indoctrinate the young. That's the phrase. And that's why you have these kids out in the streets, protesting all sorts of things. We have to have better indoctrination of the young. That's the liberals. That's the spectrum. And since then, lots of things have happened. There's been an effort to try to impose business models on the universities, cheap labor, graduate students, adjuncts instead of tenured faculty. Even university architecture has been changed. The new university architectures designs, this is worldwide incidentally, so that students don't have places to gather. Nothing like Sproul Hall in Berkeley, but just to scatter people. And the tuitions have shot way up, which is, of course, a controlling device. I mean, when I went to Penn, it was what would amount to now about maybe $1,000. And it was very easy to get a scholarship. And a large number of the students were coming subsidized under the GI Bill, which led to a huge number of people going to college who never would have gone otherwise. It was a much poorer country then. It's not a matter of the economy, their choices. Poor countries like Mexico have it right now. All of this has changed in ways to indoctrinate the young more effectively. And but protests continue. Activism continues. Things keep changing. It's class war on a particular scale doesn't end.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for that response. I'll now pass it over to Emily, who will ask our next question.
Hello, Professor. Thank you again for being here with us. So one of your most famous books, Manufacturing Consent, argues that the public's consent is manufactured by corporate mass media that upholds state authority. How has the propaganda model for the manufacture of consent evolved alongside the increasing corporate consolidation of the media? What is a feasible alternative structure for our media environment that would be less capitalist and more accountable to the people?
Well, the monopolization of the media has been going on for a long time. Don't know if you've seen one of the standard works is Ben Bagdikian's Media Monopoly, very important journalist. When he wrote the book, the first edition must have been around 1980. I think there were about 50 major media centers. By the time his last edition came out, maybe in the 90s, or in this millennium probably, I think it was down to less than 10. And now there are even fewer with the conglomerates. And of course, the media landscape has shifted, but in many ways. So the media are, the mainstream media, like New York Times, CBS, are actually more open and broader in willingness to tolerate things than they were 50 years ago. Part of the reason is people like you, young people who had their experiences in the 60s and 70s. Many of them worked their way into the media, kind of opened them up. And the constant pressures from outside have had the same effect. You see it all over. I mean, take, say, the 1619 series that the New York Times ran a couple of months ago, I guess. A history of Afro-American history for 400 years. Not bad. Could have been inconceivable a couple of years ago. It's so it goes in both ways. Propaganda model remains about the same. The same kind of factors. The media are still basically major corporations selling audiences to other businesses, advertisers, closely linked to government. All of that basically remains in force and has the effects on filtering and shaping that you'd predict. But it changes. There's more pressures from powerful forces who see things getting out of control. There's more activism and engagement on the part of the general public. We see it in the political system as well. The Democratic Party right now is split between the Clintonite neoliberal party managers and the party base, voting base. A lot of young people pushing it towards the more progressive side. And you see it every time you take a look at the newspapers. So on some respects, Biden's program has been pushed farther to the left than anything basically since Roosevelt. On other things, say the military budget, way to the right. That's constant pressures.
Thank you for your response. I'll now pass it to Selene from Penn Against the Occupation for the next question.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Thank you, Emily. Professor Chomsky, we fought over like kids in Penn Against the Occupation to see who was gonna have the honor to ask you the question. So I made it, and I brushed my hair for this event, which I haven't done since in-person classes, to be frank. So here's the question. Many people who generally support progressive anti-racist movements fail to recognize Israel as an apartheid state. What barriers stand in the way of the left uniting behind Palestinian liberation, and how can we overcome them? What role does Israeli propaganda, especially that which labels critics of Israel anti-Semitic, play in inhibiting this unification?
Well, some very interesting things have happened about that. But to get to the question of what's missing, an activist solidarity group, there's a great deal that it could do if it existed. Just take a look at what's happened in the country with regard to Israel and Palestine. It's a total sea change. You go back 10 or 20 years, Israel was the darling of the liberals. You couldn't say a word to criticize it. You couldn't have an article, couldn't write anything in the newspapers. The liberal journals wouldn't accept anything. It's all gone. The New York Review of Books, main left liberal journal, till about 10 years ago, it never touched the issue. Hot potato. Now it's writing articles pretty much like what you just said, condemning the apartheid state in great detail. Recent article by Nathan Thrall supporting the B'Tselem report, which declared Israel to be an apartheid state between the Jordan and Mediterranean. Huge change. And it's a change that's based on a change of public attitudes. Israel is no longer, the main support of Israel is not liberal Democrats anymore. It's evangelical Christians and right-wing Republicans. That's a major shift. It's happened because, first of all, because of things that have happened there, but also because of a lot of activist pressure here. Now, can you do more to break what you've talked about? Yes. In fact, there are many sensitive points in the system of control that can be pressed hard and can lead to major changes. Like, let's take just one. Suppose there was a real activist movement for Palestinian solidarity. One thing they'd be pointing out and working on is that the huge US aid to Israel, unprecedented, there's nothing like it, is probably illegal under US law. US law, Symington Amendment, makes it illegal for a country to develop nuclear weapons outside the framework of the international system. Israel's, of course, done it massively. Notice that the United States does not recognize that Israel has nuclear weapons. This is the reason. They don't want to open that door. You recognize they have nuclear weapons, American law starts coming into play. There'll be plenty of people in the country, not just on the left, who don't see any point in giving tens of billions of dollars to that country over there. If you tell them it's all illegal, you have a movement going. You might have then debates with lawyers about whether it's technically illegal or not. That doesn't matter. Once this is on the agenda, you've opened up a lot of doors. And notice that it's related to something very significant that's kept under a tight veil, a tight blanket of control, because it's too significant to talk about, but it's right near the surface. What's called the greatest threat to world peace now, all over the place, is Iran's programs of maybe developing nuclear weapons. Huge business, bipartisan, all over the press. Now, what do we, another articles every day. Is there a solution to that? Stop to think for a second. It's a trivial solution. Establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East with intensive inspections, which work. We've seen that with the joint agreement. So what's barring it? United States, nothing else. Iran strongly in favor of it. Arab states strongly in favor of it. The global South very strongly in favor of it. Europe's not making any objections. It's vetoed by the United States every time it comes up. Most recently, Obama. Why is it vetoed? Well, for the reason I just mentioned. You can't allow Israel's nuclear weapons to be inspected. Because if you do, the question will come up, what about all of US aid to Israel? So all of this has to be silenced, all of it. I mean, it's not that you get shot if you say it. I mean, I'm saying it, nobody's going to do anything. I've said it a million other times. Other people have too. But it can't break through the barriers. That's manufacturing consent with a vengeance, okay? It's, and if there were a serious activist solidarity group, I think they could break through on this. There are many things like this. That's how changes have taken place. You go back, it's worthwhile to go back 60 years or so and see what the country was like and see how much has been achieved mainly by student activism. You go back to the 1960s, this country had anti-miscegenation laws that were so extreme that the Nazis wouldn't accept them. One drop of blood, that was too extreme for the Nazis, was rampant here. Federal housing was segregated by law that had a huge effect. It meant the big federal housing boom in the 50s, which African Americans were blocked from it at a period when, for the first time, a Black man could get a decent job in an auto factory. Well, in the United States, wealth is largely property. So that means a generation of Blacks who could have made it into the society didn't. It's a crushing legacy up till today on top of the horrors before it. Women in the 1960s were not peers. They were property. by law goes back to the founding of the country, which adopted British common law. Women are property of their father, handed over to their husband. That was technically US law up until the mid-70s, when finally the Supreme Court declared that women have the right to serve on federal juries, meaning their peers. All sorts of things. I mean, anti-sodomy laws went on into this millennium. There's been enormous changes in the country. The anti-war when the anti-Vietnam War movement started, you literally couldn't get 5 people together to talk about it. You try to have a small demonstration in a liberal city like Boston and be broken up by students. It took a long time for these things to take on, but it happened. And things like that can happen now. There are things, the most important things are never talked about. They're too important. So take the 80s. Something very significant happened in the 80s in opposition to aggression and terror and torture. Happened in the United States. It had never happened before in the history of imperialism. For the first time in the history of imperialism, people from the aggressor country, that's us, went to live with the victims to try to help them, protect them, give them whatever protection a white face might give, help them recover from the attacks the US was supporting with Central America, Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America. They're still the main source of what's called the immigration crisis. You destroy the place, yeah, people flee from it. It's all on the front pages. This was thousands of Americans who went down there and did that. A lot of them from religious communities, evangelical churches in the Midwest, a lot of young students, all sorts of people, my kids, plenty of others. It's never happened before. Did anybody during the Vietnam War go to live in a Vietnamese village? Did anybody, when the French were destroying Algeria, there were protests, but did anybody go live in an Algerian village to try to help people? It never occurred to anyone. That's a major change in the history of imperialism. I'm pretty sure you don't study it in your classes. Well, they don't write about it in the newspapers. It's far too important. But things like that are happening all the time. You look around, you see them. Come to the recent period. We happen to be in a moment where your generation, like it or not, is going to have to determine whether human society persists. It's as simple as that. If the environmental crisis isn't dealt with in 10 or 20 years, we're basically toast. We'll reach irreversible tipping points. Can't get out of that. Well, some sort of Green New Deal is essential for survival. 4 or 5 years ago, it was mentioned at all, it was an object of ridicule. Now it's on the legislative agenda, not in the right form, but at least it's there. How did that happen? Well, a lot of activism, but it culminated in a group of young people, Sunrise Movement, who occupied congressional offices, including Nancy Pelosi's office. They were supported by some of the young representatives who swept in on the Sanders wave. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez mainly, a senator from Massachusetts, senior senator who was sympathetic, Ed Markey, he joined in. Okay, it's on the legislative agenda, there's some hope. These are not small things. These are huge things. That's why you don't hear about them. And that's the kind of thing that can go on all the time, and it's basically your responsibility to carry forward. There's plenty of activism, Extinction Rebellion, global climate strike, every area, and it's had an effect. I mean, you take a look at Biden. Biden was a conservative, centrist Democrat all his career. Take a look at his Council of Economic Advisors. It has people on it who write for radical economic journals. So there's a huge change, and it's showing up in policy efforts. Well, these things don't happen by magic. They take hard work.
You're right. It is certainly hopeful to hear that. I will now pass it on over to Tahara from Penn Justice Dems for the last question.
Hi, I'm Tara. Thank you so much for being here, Professor. We all really appreciate your time. You have mentioned before that we do not live in a capitalist society, but a state capitalist society. How enduring do you believe the system will be in the short run, let's say in the next 30 years, and the long run? And how close are we to a breaking point, and what comes after that?
Sorry, I didn't. Did you write this? I heard half of it, but only half.
Oh, I can repeat it. So you have mentioned before that we do not live in a capitalist society, but a state capitalist society.
Yeah.
How enduring do you believe the system will be in the short run, in the next 30 years, let's say, and the long run? How close are we to a breaking point, and what comes after that?
It's up to you. First of all, nobody's ever lived in a capitalist society. A capitalist society would self-destruct in no time. So in fact, the business world constantly intervenes to make sure that they're not subject to the ravages of the market, which would destroy everything almost immediately. May work in an economic seminar, but it doesn't have to do with the world. So we all live in some kind of state capitalist societies. What's coming next? Well, actually, it's very much it's very contentious right at this moment. We're right in the middle of a pandemic. Sooner or later, we'll get out of it at huge cost, needless cost. We know it's needless because countries that have done something serious have gotten out of it. Vietnam has almost no cases, right on the border of China, poor country. Taiwan, half dozen cases. Cuba, almost no cases. New Zealand, living normally. A lot of things that can be done if they weren't done here, but they could be. But sooner or later, it'll get over. I mean, I was born not long after a much worse pandemic. The flu, the 1920 flu killed maybe 50 million people or so, way more than this. But we got over it, and we'll get over this. But the question is, what will the post-pandemic world be? That's being contested vigorously right now, and you ought to be involved in it because that's going to determine the future. There's the usual sort of class war going on. The forces that created the neoliberal disaster of the last 40 years, which actually has a big role in the fact that the pandemic came. The people who created that are working very hard to ensure that it's reinstituted in a harsher, more cruel form, more surveillance, more controlled, better means of propaganda, indoctrination, structures, and so on. There are other forces around the world trying to create a different world. Well, we don't know who's going to win. You never do. But the struggle's going on right now. And how it comes out will help answer your question. There are actually international institutions trying to get involved. You don't read about it much, but there's a Progressive International recently formed, just had its first international meeting in Iceland, where the prime minister is a member of the directing board. It sort of grew out of the Sanders movement in the United States and a similar movement in Europe. Yanis Varoufakis's the M25. It's a transnational European Union that's trying to salvage what makes sense in the European Union and to get rid of the rest. A lot of it's very harmful. It has a lot of global South participants all over the world, and it's trying to bring together forces around the world that will deal with these issues. Many of them are very lively right now. I mean, some of them are really existential problems. I'm sure you know about them. Take, say, vaccines. If the poor countries of the world, Africa, Asia, if they don't get vaccinated pretty quickly, not only is it horrible for them, but it's horrible for us. The virus is mutating. Nobody knows exactly how, but it could very well get very lethal forms. This virus is highly contagious, but not too lethal, statistically speaking. Other coronaviruses like Ebola are highly lethal, but not too contagious. And we don't know that we'll be so lucky next time. Next one around may be highly lethal, highly contagious, and could be mutating right now in Central Africa. So what are the rich countries doing? Monopolizing the vaccines for themselves. Not just take the US. The US happens to have extra vaccines right now because the FDA has not authorized the AstraZeneca vaccine. So we've got a big store of them. So Biden did something about it. He gave them to other countries. To the countries that need them? No. He gave them to Canada, which has a bigger store of excess vaccines than any country in the world, way more than it can ever use, and to Mexico as a bribe so that Mexico would keep people fleeing from the wreckage we created from coming to our country. Very nice. Gave the vaccines away. Well, you know, people like you can be doing something about that. Now, there are countries there are actually internationalist countries. Very few. There's one not very far from us called Cuba. It's the only real internationalist country in the world. So what does the United States do about that? Well, try to strangle them, try to destroy them, and just keep to the vaccine, just the vaccine. Here's something you probably didn't read in the newspaper. The Health and Human Services Department a couple of months ago came out with its report for 2020. It's Azar's department under Trump. Came out with its annual report for 2020, talking about all the wonderful things they did. You read it carefully, there's a couple of very interesting things that they did. One of them was to pressure Panama, poor country, serious virus disease, pressured Panama to refuse the aid of Cuban doctors. And they're very proud of that. They achieved it. We saved the continent from the malign influence of Cuba, which is the one country in the world that's sending out doctors to help people. Gotta protect ourselves from that. There was another part. Brazil, you've probably read in the papers, is a total disaster area. The president is a Trump clone. It's caused an utter disaster, short of vaccines, nothing. But the department, the Health and Human Services Department, helped take care of that. The American embassy pressured Cuba not to use Russian vaccines, which are the same as Western vaccines. Medical journals tell you that. But we've got to prevent their malign influence, is what it's called, from spreading in the hemisphere. Things like this are going on before your eyes constantly. Actually, not before your eyes, because you have to dig a little to find them, but they're there. And all of these things have to do with what kind of a world is going to come out. So it's not the kind of thing you speculate about, it's the kind of thing you do something about. remember that there's a constant class war going on. The business classes are dedicated Marxists, values inverted, but they're constantly fighting a bitter class war, never relent. You can read it in the business journals. Like when in the 1930s, when I was a kid, the business world was very concerned about the New Deal, didn't like it. And you read in the business press about how, I'm quoting now, we have to fight the everlasting battle for the minds of men and indoctrinate people with the capitalist story so they can repeat it in their sleep. That's been going on for many years, and we see the results. That's why there's no unions. That's why the labor movement has been crushed. A lot of work taking off pretty much since Reagan. Reagan understood very well that if you're going to, or whoever did his thinking for him understood very well that if you're going to impose the neoliberal programs that are advocated by the business world and the economics profession, it's going to be a terrible blow to people, as has proven to be. So you have to eliminate their means of defense, obviously. The means of defense are labor unions. So therefore, the first move of the Reagan administration was to crush the unions, break strikes, using scabs, which was illegal everywhere except South Africa, opened the doors for business to do the same. They know what they're doing. They're fighting a constant, relentless class war. Doesn't stop. Now, that's, of course, not the image. The image is we're what we're called soulful corporations who are dedicated to the benefit of all of you people. We work work day and night to help you and so on and so forth. Just trust us. Yeah, that's right. But they're actually fighting a class war, and you can see it. We see it again right in front of us. Like, here's something else you may or may not have read. I didn't see it in the papers. The Rand Corporation, very super respectable, quasi-governmental corporation, very reliable, just tried to do an estimate of how much money was transferred during the neoliberal years, the 40 years, transferred from the lower 90% of the population to the very top. Their estimate is $47 trillion stolen from the working class and the middle class for the very rich, top of fraction of 1%, most of it. It didn't happen by magic, didn't happen by laws of economics, happened by policy, explicit policy. You can trace the policies. In fact, just talk about unions. There's a very close correlation between unionization and democracy. As level of unionization goes up, inequality, so also democracy, inequality goes up as unionization goes down, and conversely. Same is true of the minimum wage. It goes up as unionization goes up. Same actually is democracy, which I said by accident, because as you get concentration of wealth, greater concentration, you get less democracy by almost automatic means. So these are policy decisions made by a very class-conscious business class and the representatives in government, which they pretty much own, working for their own interests, obviously, and the population suffers from them. Well, those are not laws of nature. You can change them, and they are being changed. Sanders' movement was an example. It's worth remembering how extraordinary the Sanders movement was. This is the first time in a century that a political candidate has been able to reach fairly high position, almost won, without any support from the business world, the corporate sector, the media, nowhere. That hasn't happened for over 100 years. In the United States, elections are pretty much bought. You can predict the outcome of an election with very high precision just by looking at campaign spending. Well, this broke a pattern of a century, and it's having effects. Mainly it's due to lots of young people who did the work. So you can answer that question. You're the only person who can answer your question. What do we do to bring about a different world?